Welcome back everyone to the Anvil. Today we're going to be talking about one of my absolute favourite topics, which is essentially load selection and answering the question, what weight do I lift? Now, obviously there is testing procedures. We'll do 1RMs and whatnot to assess what your maximum potential is within a certain exercise, and we will then calculate the appropriate loads based off percentages and so on. However, there will be times within your program, whether it's through assistance exercises, whether it's through RPE based training, where you have to figure out what weight to lift yourself. And ultimately that will give you that independence to know when you're doing an exercise safely. Now ultimately, one of the biggest injury risk factors that people need to be aware of isn't actually exercise technique, it's more the appropriate load. So if you're lifting a really heavy weight, okay, that's too heavy for you, and you're trying to do it with good technique, i.e. a neutral spine and so on within different exercises, you can still actually injure yourself. Whereas you're much less likely to injure yourself if you lift something with not so optimal technique, but the weight is significantly reduced and you're not actually putting yourself under any unnecessary risk. So the simple question, what weight do I lift? How do you figure it out? Well, to understand this, we have to be aware of stress and the stress response within the body and different types of stress that we experience. So we may all be familiar with eustress and distress, which is basically the way in which we distinguish between positive outcomes or positive stress within our body and distress, which is the negative side of things as well. However, there's another way of categorizing it within looking at distress, i.e. something that is inflicted upon the body, either through exercise or otherwise. There are non-productive and productive forms of stress. Now, it's important to distinguish between this because people are often unaware of what the exercise response actually is and how the body perceives it. Ultimately, the body can't determine between whether or not the deadlift is self-inflicted or whether it's something that you've been forced to do, whether it's an injury of some kind or a stress that's placed, or strain rather, that's placed on the bodily tissues that could cause further damage. So it's the reason why, or it's the explanation rather, behind what's known as the repeated bout effect. When you first start doing training, you may have significant muscle soreness, okay? So it's known as DOMS, everyone throws it around, you know, or if you can't walk the next day after leg day, did you even do it right? Whereas we know fully that muscle soreness isn't an indicator of a good workout. It's a byproduct, okay? So if you could have had an absolutely fantastic workout and not be sore and still benefit from it, okay? If you want me to go into more detail about that, we can do on a separate topic, but today we're just, like I said, covering the stress response. Now, once your body becomes familiar with that stress and is aware that it is a productive form of stress, the soreness response starts to decrease, but the adaptations actually increase because your body is aware of how to utilize and has more positive signal into the stimulus that you put it under. So what is a form of non-productive stress? The easiest way I liken this, okay, because people distinguish when it comes to weights, they think that, well, if I'm not lifting heavy, it's not productive. So surely to be on this side of things, I have to be slamming on the weight and I have to be pushing myself and doing exercises that are specific, like we've talked about before, and otherwise it's not productive. Ultimately, a novel stimulus that the body isn't aware of is a non-productive form of stress, okay? And intensity is one factor, but not the only factor that determines whether or not your body will respond. The way I kind of liken it is, if I set you on fire, okay, and that was it, that was a form of stress on the body, okay? A very intense one. I'm sure most people would turn around and say that was pretty intense, but it's not a positive thing. It doesn't mean your body's going to respond immediately to it in any positive way. So when we lift a weight that's far too heavy for us, that doesn't mean it's a positive thing. Just because we've strained against that resistance and we, you know, put the bar down or we rack the bar and we feel like we've got to pass out and everything, that doesn't mean the body's going to go, dude, that was awesome, I'm going to, you know, get stacked now and increase my strength significantly. It has to be a productive form of stress that the body can positively adapt to. And the reason this is with a more kind of relatable topic rather than talking about setting you on fire, if you've ever tried to max out every single day, in theory, if the only thing that mattered was the intensity and lifting the most weight we possibly could, you'd just max out every single time you went in the gym. Okay, you just keep maxing out every single day, 7 days a week, and you would continue to get infinitely stronger. Unfortunately, we know that's not the way it works. Now, when we're a beginner to training, okay, we tend to get what's known as LP candidates, so people that can progress very well on what's known as linear progression, where you literally just keep the reps the same and just gradually increase the intensity. But eventually you'll reach a point where that doesn't become productive anymore because it's too challenging from an intensity standpoint. So how do we distinguish between what is known as a productive and non-productive stimulus other than just weight? Well, also the novelty of that stimulus and whether or not you've got a good mechanical position. So as we've said, the weight on the bar is a big distinguishing factor between the two. If it's too heavy, okay, then it can become non-productive and it can become too taxing for the body to positively respond to. In addition to that, and kind of alongside it, if you present with faulty mechanics, lifting a weight that's too heavy, it becomes a non-productive stress. Now, this might sound conflicting when we talk about the fact that exercise technique isn't necessarily a huge injury risk factor, provided that the load is appropriate. When we're talking about faulty mechanics, we're referring to a deviation from that individual's technique. Now, you won't necessarily see this with beginners or people that are more novice in the world of strength and lifting. This tends to occur more within an intermediate to advanced stage, but over time you'll start to individualize your technique that might actually, for some people, depending on individual build and overall leverages and whatnot, it might deviate away from neutral. So there are a lot of people that deadlift with a slight rounding in their thoracic spine, and this isn't necessarily a huge injury risk, again, provided the load is appropriate. But when we refer to whether or not that stress is non-productive and it presents with faulty mechanics, that's in reference, like I said, to deviation from their own typical technique in that movement. So again, let's keep the rounded back deadlift in mind. If you take that individual that spent years honing their technique within that rounded position and then force them into a flat back position, squeeze the shoulder blades back, and it's a mechanical position that for their body is deemed as faulty or different to what they would normally have, and then you try and load it as heavy as possible, that actually has a greater injury risk than keeping that individual in that position that most people would consider deviates away from neutral. So it's just something to bear in mind that faulty mechanics in this instance refers to deviation away from the individual's technique as opposed to deviation away from a universal gold standard neutral position. And this goes back to law 1 of consistency. We talked about we want a consistent technique. If every single time you bench press, okay, 1 minute it touches here, next minute it touches too high, next minute you don't go all the way down, you've got faulty mechanics and it's inconsistent, so that becomes a non-productive stress. Now, non-productive stress doesn't always manifest itself in injury. Sometimes it just manifests itself in performance plateaus. You just don't get stronger. Your body doesn't respond. And this is one of the explanations behind the topic, or rather the phrase within research, which is whereas people are known as non-responders, it's typically down to faulty program design and the fact that the people aren't executing the movement adhering to all those laws of strength. So we know that faulty mechanics are an issue as well. And like I said, the novel stimulus. When it is novel to begin with, it's not a very productive stressor. Now that might throw kind of a spanner into the works for a few people when they're trying to understand variations, but bear with me. When you first introduce a novel stimulus, okay, your coordination is subpar to say the least. So your body can't gain that, no matter how much you focus, your body cannot gain consistent technique. It can't coordinate the movement because it's still trying to figure things out. So it is a productive stimulus provided you keep the weight low. Let's take, for example, the yoke walk, okay? So it's an exercise. If you've got a semi-decent squat from a powerlifting standpoint, and you've got a pretty strong set of legs and a pretty strong set of abs, you can put a yoke on your back and it can seem like you can, even though you can put one foot in front of the other, it can seem like you can handle a pretty decent amount of weight. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing, okay? You want to start relatively light and work your way up. That's why we've always talked about appropriate load, because when it's a novel stimulus, if it's too heavy, it's just not productive. I have this issue a lot of times when I get people that transfer from one sport to another, or people that are naturally strong, people that have never really picked up a barbell before, and they can dive in, and just because they can pull 200 kilograms doesn't mean they should straight away. Like I said, it's trying to gain that consistency. So what is a productive stimulus? We've talked about everything that could go wrong. How do we know what is a productive stress and how that ties into what weight we should lift? Well, simple. Appropriate load, okay? It's not about how you feel. It's about gaining consistent technique, and it's about being in a position where we can present with really, really good mechanics. So if that means that you have been able to move the deadlift bar from A to B with 180 kilograms on it, but it's inconsistent, will result in a pretty non-productive stress, it might be that you have to spend a decent amount of time with 140 kilograms. And this is one of the problems with looking at the percentage kind of chart in terms of, if you look at Prilipin's chart, or, you know, Dan Baker's work on exertion and whatnot, if you look at 8 reps equals 75% or whatever, it's not always that simple. Law number 3 is law of individuality. For you as an individual, the appropriate load might be 60% for 8 reps, which is significantly lower than what you'd think. But again, it's about making it a productive stress to your bodily systems. For it to be productive, we want to yield a positive response. Now, I know that sounds like a very, very vague statement, but it's simple. If you feel better afterwards, okay, if your performance increases, if your soreness decreases, if you don't get an inflammatory response within your joints, such as pain. So if you go from deadlifting and you have significant low back pain that affects everything, and then we drop the weight by 10 kilograms, you do the same amount of reps and you don't have soreness, it's a much better stimulus. And then finally, when you go from being when the stimulus goes, from being a novel stimulus towards a more refined motor skill, and you become a highly skilled individual within that specific movement, okay, then it becomes more productive. And it's simple to look at it in that way. From a real life example, there are people that don't necessarily have the best technique. Even the top end, strongest people that you will ever see, some of them have really good technique. Some of them, you look at it and you're like, how are they lifting that weight and not getting injured? If they've built up with it being a novel stimulus with appropriate load, okay, if they've built up from that and gradually refined their own individual technique and become highly skilled, it becomes a productive stress and the body can adapt to it. It's that simple. The body is a very malleable kind of structure. So how does it affect training? Simply put, sometimes, depending on you as the individual, and that's the job of the coach, but also you yourself, sometimes you have to be honest. Is it a productive stimulus, okay? Do you get a positive response from it? If it feels like you've been hit by a truck every single time you train, okay, and you're a relative beginner, that isn't always a good thing. It's that simple, okay? It's about gaining consistency. Just always keep that in your mind. If it's a novel stimulus, okay, so if you are new to that exercise, myself, for example, I've been training for well over a decade, easily, okay, pretty consistently in terms of lifting and everything. When I go in to do an overhead squat, just because my shoulders can tolerate a decent amount of weight, and I can squat a decent amount of weight, I'll still start with the bar and I will still gradually increase it, because ultimately it's about keeping it as a productive output of performance. When it comes to changing over from a conventional deadlift and rotating in sumo deadlifts, I know I can deadlift over 200 kilograms in a sumo stance, but I won't dive into that because, again, it's relatively novel in terms of how my body is adapting to stress. So it's not always a beneficial thing to dive in head first. So, just to summarise for you guys, members of the Forge, and when you are going through the training process, if there is an exercise on your program that states that you need to decide what weight you want to lift, and it's a new exercise, you always want to err on the side of caution. Not from an injury risk standpoint, okay, because I know most people rather, that goes in one ear and out the other. It's purely from making it a productive stress. Again, it's about consistency. So if you've never done a dumbbell press before, okay, and you come into doing a dumbbell press, don't all of a sudden go up to the maximum weight that you can. Just go up to a weight that feels pretty comfortable and then start to challenge it from that new set point that you've made. Conversely, if you have done the exercise, okay, for a very long period of time, you're relatively skilled within that movement, your mechanics are on point, okay, you can ramp it up and you can start to increase the weight. So a lot of training cycles that I take people through, particularly specialist training cycles, when they're wanting to maximize their strength within a given movement, even when they can deadlift 300 kilograms, they will start that training cycle just doing rep work and refining the motor skill, okay, with 200 kilograms. Significantly lower intensity, but ultimately it's about building up that consistent, productive stress response. So guys, hope you enjoyed the talk about the stress response and how we decide what weight we're going to lift within exercises. I've just got 3 questions for you to incite a little bit of curiosity and hopefully to get you to take away a lesson from today. So the first question is, it's a bit of a memory test, okay? What is the difference, just a simple response, what is the difference between a non-productive and a productive stress response? And can you give me an example of a non-productive stress response? Number 2, what are the 3 biggest factors that contribute to a movement being classified as a non-productive stress? Give you one of them. If it's a novel stimulus, so if it's an exercise that you've not really done before, that is a pretty big factor as to whether or not it's going to become a non-productive stress if it's in conjunction with the other 2 factors. And then finally, number 3, just a question of curiosity. There's no right or wrong answer. It's just purely to find a little bit of information about you guys. Have you ever come across an exercise that you've never done before and seem to take to it like a natural and able to lift a pretty heavy weight? Myself, for example, when I first deadlifted, I seemed to find it alright. There was no real issue. I've never really suffered, touch wood, with low back pain, and I was able to deadlift a pretty substantial weight for my age and weight. So, what is that exercise for you?